The official history of the Orphan Train Movement is presented as a triumph of compassion. Between the 1850s and the early 20th century, tens of thousands of homeless and abandoned children were transported from overcrowded eastern cities to rural families across the American Midwest. The story is told as a simple equation. Urban poverty met rural opportunity. Children rescued from starvation, placed into homes, and given a chance to begin again. On paper it reads clean, efficient, benevolent. Charitable organizations organized the trains, churches coordinated placements, newspapers celebrated the effort, politicians praised it as one of the great humanitarian programs of the era, and for generations the narrative remained intact, a logistical challenge overcome by goodwill and moral urgency. But official stories rarely explain the full mechanism. They describe outcomes, not processes. They highlight intention, not consequence, and they tend to soften anything that complicates the message. Because when you look closer, not at the speeches or pamphlets, but at the operational details, the picture begins to distort. Records indicate that some trains carried hundreds of children at a time. Many were under 5 years old. Few had documentation. Siblings were separated without record. Names were changed. Ages were estimated. Medical histories vanished. Entire identities were erased and rewritten in transit. The official explanation suggests this was simply administrative chaos, a young system struggling to manage overwhelming numbers. But certain details refuse to settle into that explanation. Transport logs show repeated route adjustments that made little geographic sense. Placement records contain gaps so large they can't be attributed to clerical error. In some cases, trains are documented arriving, but the children they carried never appear in any settlement records. No adoption files, no labour contracts, no census appearances. They simply disappear. Even more unsettling are the structural remnants tied to these operations. Sub-basements beneath former aid societies, bricked over corridors in stations once used for temporary holding, storage facilities large enough for hundreds built below ground, never mentioned in planning documents. These are not symbolic spaces. They are physical ones, measured, engineered, hidden. According to official accounts, children were briefly housed, then swiftly placed. There was no need for large-scale containment infrastructure, no reason for reinforced underground rooms, no logistical requirement for extended confinement. And yet, these spaces exist. Municipal archives acknowledge their construction but offer no explanation for their purpose. Blueprints label them vaguely. Service areas, storage, utility chambers, terminology broad enough to avoid detail, precise enough to satisfy oversight. The silence is systematic. No personal diaries mention them. No newspapers describe their use. No organizational reports clarify their function. The spaces remain, but their story does not. The first hint that something had been carefully omitted came not from historians but from contractors. During routine renovations in a long-abandoned station, workers uncovered sealed corridors leading to a subterranean chamber. Inside were rusted bed frames, numbered tags, and transport crates stacked against the walls. No names, no destinations, no explanation, only numbers. And the quiet suggestion that the official story may be describing only the surface. The chamber beneath the abandoned station was not supposed to exist. According to municipal records, the foundations ended 3 meters below ground. There were no permits for lower construction, no engineering approvals, no funding allocations. Yet behind the newly exposed brick wall was a corridor descending another 6 meters, its steps worn smooth by decades of foot traffic. The workers initially assumed it was a forgotten utility passage. Older buildings often contained undocumented service routes, added and removed as infrastructure evolved. But this space was different. The brickwork was uniform, the arches reinforced, the ventilation shafts deliberately placed. This was not an improvised tunnel, it was purpose-built. At the corridor's end lay a rectangular chamber, nearly the length of a railway carriage. Rusted iron frames lined the walls in 2 stacked tiers. The floor bore faint grooves where wheeled platforms had repeatedly rolled back and forth. Bolted into the ceiling were hooks, evenly spaced, forming a rigid grid. Not for lighting, not for pipes. Their purpose was unclear. Scattered across the floor were small metal discs, each stamped with a number. Some were bent, others snapped in half. Many were still attached to fragments of thin chain. No names, no dates, only numbers. When these findings were reported, officials offered a swift explanation. The room, they said, was likely a temporary shelter. The numbered tags were for inventory control. The hooks were for storage equipment. The iron frames were dismissed as outdated shelving. It was a tidy solution, but it failed under even modest scrutiny. The spacing of the frames matched the dimensions of child-sized beds. The height between tiers allowed barely enough room for a person to sit upright. The grooves in the floor followed a repeated linear path between the corridor entrance and the far wall, suggesting routine movement of loaded carts. And the numbered discs, none exceeded 3 digits, implying a controlled counting system rather than random storage labelling. The official explanation also struggled to account for scale. This was not a single isolated room. Further clearing revealed branching corridors, each leading to smaller chambers of identical design. Together they formed a subterranean complex capable of housing several hundred individuals simultaneously, directly beneath a station that on paper processed only small daily groups. When local historians were consulted, none recalled any reference to underground holding facilities. Contemporary newspaper archives were silent. Aid Society reports mentioned temporary accommodation, but offered no descriptions, no locations, no photographs. The deeper the workers excavated, the more systematic the layout became. Corridors aligned with platform access points, ventilation shafts connected to disguised surface grates, drainage channels fed into the city's stormwater system. This was an engineered network, yet it appeared nowhere in official blueprints. As news of the discovery spread, access was abruptly restricted. Municipal safety inspectors sealed off the site, citing structural concerns. Within days, the chamber entrances were boarded and the area placed under administrative review. No formal investigation was announced. No public statement clarified the room's function. The simplest explanation, forgotten shelter space, remained the official position. But the physical evidence suggested something else, a hidden operational layer beneath the visible machinery of the Orphan Train system. A layer designed not for brief shelter, but for controlled containment. And that raised a question the records refused to answer. Why would a humanitarian operation require underground facilities of this scale, and then erase all trace of their existence? Once access was briefly restored, the engineering details became impossible to ignore. Beneath the station, the corridors extended far beyond what early construction standards would suggest. Laser measurements revealed uniform depths across multiple chambers, all positioned at precisely the same subterranean level, as if dictated by a master plan rather than ad hoc expansion. The walls were built from dense vitrified brick, the kind used for load-bearing industrial infrastructure, not temporary shelters. The mortar composition matched late 19th century rail tunnel construction, not civilian basements. This was heavy engineering. Even more striking was the precision. Every corridor maintained a consistent width. Every arch peaked at the same height. Drainage channels ran at carefully calculated slopes, converging toward a central filtration shaft. Ventilation ducts were spaced with mathematical regularity, feeding air from surface grates concealed behind architectural ornamentation. This was not the chaotic footprint of rushed charity work. It was a deliberate subterranean system, and the deeper investigators mapped it, the stranger it became. The complex extended well beyond the footprint of the station itself. Some chambers reached beneath adjacent streets, intersecting with utility tunnels and freight passages that were constructed decades later, which meant the orphan facility had been there first, and subsequent infrastructure had been built around it. This should not exist here. According to official construction timelines, no project of this depth or scale was approved for the station during that era. Financial records show no budget allocations remotely sufficient to support underground expansion. Engineering permits are absent. Contractor registries list no companies capable of executing work of this magnitude on site. Yet the materials, craftsmanship and alignment are unmistakable. Photographs taken during the brief access window capture rows of identical chambers stretching into darkness. Each contains the same bed frame geometry, the same ceiling hooks, the same floor tracks. In one image, chalk markings remain faintly visible along a wall. Vertical lines evenly spaced, each topped with a small horizontal notch, forming a silent height measurement grid. Not architectural, biological. Several early engineers who reviewed the images privately expressed unease. The design principles resembled those used in controlled population facilities, environments intended for monitoring, processing, and movement efficiency, not comfort, not care. Officially, the chambers were labelled as storage and service areas. But storage does not require ventilation symmetry. Service areas do not need reinforced drainage, and humanitarian shelters do not need transport grooves worn into stone. Further contradictions emerged in archived shipping manifests. Crates delivered to the station during peak orphan train years far exceeded what food, bedding, or clothing distribution would require. Some were marked only with numerical codes, their contents unspecified, their destinations listed simply as internal transfer. No corresponding inventory logs exist, no disposal records, no secondary transport documents. The physical evidence suggests sustained operations, long-term, large-scale, and carefully controlled, functioning beneath the surface of a program remembered for its simplicity. And yet, no public record acknowledges any such infrastructure. The absence is total. No blueprints, no correspondence, no financial audits, no construction reports. It is as though this entire layer of activity was never meant to exist. And once its purpose was fulfilled, its memory was systematically erased. What remains is architecture without narrative. And architecture does not lie. It only waits. What initially appeared as an isolated anomaly began to reorganize itself into something far more deliberate once comparable sites were examined. The first parallel discovery surfaced hundreds of miles away, beneath a decommissioned station that once served as a primary orphan train departure hub. Renovation crews there uncovered sealed sublevels nearly identical in depth, layout, and material composition. Brick curvature, corridor width, ventilation spacing, even the angle of the drainage slopes matched within fractions of a degree. Independent engineering teams, unaware of the earlier findings, produced blueprints that aligned almost perfectly. This was no coincidence. As records from other former transit centers were quietly reviewed, the same pattern repeated. Chicago, St. Louis, Cleveland, Omaha, Kansas City. each location tied to major orphan distribution routes, each revealing evidence of subterranean infrastructure that did not appear in official construction histories. Uniform depth, repeating geometry, consistent chamber dimensions, and shared material signatures. These were not local adaptations, they were standardized. More unsettling was their alignment. When mapped against historic rail networks, the underground complexes formed a precise chain, positioned at predictable intervals along primary transport corridors. The spacing was too regular to be organic, too systematic to be accidental. This was network design, a hidden logistical layer beneath the visible system of trains, platforms, and public waiting rooms, and it operated with a precision that implied central planning. The official explanation, that these were merely forgotten service spaces, collapsed under this scale of repetition. Independent contractors across multiple states did not spontaneously converge on the same subterranean architectural solution. Charitable organizations, often struggling for funding, did not secretly construct massive underground facilities without leaving a financial trace. Yet the structures were there, and they followed rules. Even more revealing were the minor variations. Where surface architecture reflected regional styles, the underground chambers did not. They adhered to a rigid template, as if produced from a master design, one that ignored local convention entirely. In several locations, later subway systems intersected these older chambers. In each case, municipal engineers quietly rerouted tunnels rather than disturb the pre-existing structures. Internal memos referenced legacy voids and pre-established load zones, language suggesting prior knowledge of their presence. But no public explanation followed. What had once seemed like buried anomalies now assembled into an organized framework. A continent-spanning infrastructure, built first, hidden second, forgotten last, and the children moved through it. Transport records, when layered onto this map, revealed another pattern. Certain trains consistently deviated from optimal routes, stopping at stations with known underground facilities, even when direct paths existed. The delays were never explained, the passenger counts fluctuated, the placement numbers failed to align. The trains were not merely carrying children across the country, they were feeding a system, and the system predated the narrative. This realization marked a turning point. No longer could the discoveries be dismissed as isolated construction oddities. They were components of a unified architecture, designed, implemented, and then carefully erased from historical memory, which raised a question too large to ignore. If such an organized subterranean network existed beneath the Orphan Train program, who designed it, and what was it truly built for? Once the physical pattern became undeniable, attention shifted toward the paper trail, and that is where the story began to dissolve. Early administrative reports from orphan aid societies are remarkably detailed. They describe food allocations, clothing inventories, rail schedules, volunteer rosters, donor contributions, all tracked with obsessive care. Every loaf of bread accounted for, every blanket itemized, every train car enumerated. Then abruptly the language changes. Annual reports shrink. Paragraphs become sentences. Detailed accounting gives way to broad summaries. Phrases like temporary accommodations provided as necessary replace logistical breakdowns. Where specific locations were once named, only regions remain. Where headcounts were meticulously tracked, only estimates survive. Not errors, omissions, and they occur at precisely the moment underground facilities begin appearing in construction records. Photographic documentation follows the same pattern. Early archives are dense with imagery, group portraits, station arrivals, platform gatherings, departure ceremonies. Then, suddenly, entire years contain only a handful of carefully staged images. Children posed, smiling, clean, static, nothing of transit, nothing of holding, nothing of preparation, and nothing of underground space. In municipal map collections, a similar disappearance unfolds. Pre-expansion station blueprints include detailed foundation diagrams. Later revisions omit entire sublevels. Chambers are replaced by blank zones. Structural load paths abruptly change without explanation. Drainage systems appear to feed into nowhere. The architecture exists. The documentation does not. Internal correspondence, when available, grows vague. Engineers refer to existing substructures without origin. Inspectors note legacy conditions without elaboration. Contractors receive instructions to avoid certain depths during renovation, instructions that appear nowhere in public planning files. Even insurance records grow thin. Policies covering structural damage exclude specific underground areas by reference to unidentified pre-existing zones. No diagrams accompany these exclusions. Only silence. In some cases, evidence appears to have been actively removed. Archive indices list reports that no longer exist. Microfilm reels contain blank sections where documents should appear. Ledger pages show sequential numbering with missing intervals, not random loss but systematic extraction. The absence itself becomes the artifact. When historians attempted to trace procurement contracts for underground construction, they encountered an identical void. No suppliers, no invoices, no labour rosters, no transport logs for materials. Entire industrial operations vanish from the record. Yet the bricks are there, the steel is there, the ventilation systems are there, only the explanation is gone. And perhaps most telling of all is the sudden convergence of institutional language. Across multiple organisations in different states, identical phrasing begins to appear. Operational details not relevant to public reporting. Not confidential, not classified, simply not relevant, which raises a disturbing implication. Someone decided that certain aspects of the orphan train system should not enter public memory at all, not to protect privacy, not to simplify narrative, but to erase operational reality. And as years passed, the omissions hardened into history. The silences became normal. The missing pieces faded into assumed absence. Until excavation, accidental, mechanical, indifferent, began uncovering what paperwork had carefully concealed. Not forgotten, removed. And the more that vanished from the archives, the clearer one thing became. The most important part of the system was never meant to be documented. The deepest chambers were not found beneath stations. They were discovered beneath facilities never officially associated with the orphan train program at all. Abandoned hospitals, defunct industrial schools, remote agricultural compounds, even decommissioned military depots. Each site, when excavated or renovated, revealed underground structures bearing the same architectural signature, identical brickwork matching ventilation geometry, uniform drainage slope, and the same narrow bed frame layout. But here the scale changed. The chambers were larger, the corridors wider, the infrastructure more advanced. In one rural complex, engineers uncovered a subterranean hall stretching nearly 200 metres, supported by reinforced arches normally reserved for railway tunnels. Along its walls were rows of recessed alcoves, each fitted with metal restraints embedded directly into the stone. Not temporary fixtures, permanent ones. There were no signs of long-term habitation, no cooking areas, no sanitation infrastructure beyond industrial drainage, no storage for clothing or supplies, only containment and movement. Floor grooves trace precise linear paths from intake corridors to central chambers, Rail mounts embedded into the stone suggested that wheeled transport systems once operated below ground, not improvised carts, but guided track platforms. This was not shelter. This was processing architecture. Chemical residue analysis from one site detected repeated traces of industrial disinfectants, sedatives, and antiseptics, compounds consistent with medical stabilization, not household care. Yet no hospital records exist to justify such treatment volumes. Even more unsettling were the markings, height grids, weight notches, sequential numbering etched directly into walls. In several chambers, tally marks climb vertically, stopping abruptly near ceiling height, as though measurement was terminated mid-process. In one sealed compartment, workers uncovered a collapsed archive shelf containing hundreds of brittle identification tags. Each bore a single number, no names, no dates, no destinations. Some were perforated, others scorched. They were never catalogued. The most disturbing evidence emerged in structural design itself. At multiple sites, the chamber layouts match principles used in high-throughput processing facilities, the kind designed to move large populations through control stages: intake, containment, assessment, transfer, and removal. The flow logic was unmistakable. This level of logistical engineering required central coordination, long-term planning, and institutional backing far beyond charitable aid societies. Yet no such coordinating authority appears in historical records. At one site, excavators broke through a sealed corridor that terminated in a massive steel bulkhead. Beyond it lay a collapsed passage leading toward an abandoned freight tunnel. Geological analysis suggested the tunnel had been intentionally destabilized, forcing a cave-in that permanently sealed access. A deliberate shutdown, not abandonment, not decay, termination. Across multiple states, similar patterns emerged: chambers abruptly sealed, access routes collapsed, ventilation shafts blocked, drainage systems plugged, infrastructure buried beneath fresh concrete and labelled as structural reinforcement. Within a span of less than 5 years, the entire subterranean network appears to have been systematically neutralised, not dismantled, not repurposed, erased. And with its physical shutdown came a narrative one. Archival silence intensified, reports ceased entirely, photographic documentation vanished, the orphan train story simplified, reduced to departure and arrival, rescue and placement. Everything between disappeared, which leaves a final unsettling implication. If this hidden infrastructure was not built for care, and not designed for shelter, then its true purpose may have been so incompatible with public memory that the only acceptable response was total removal. From the ground, from the record, from history itself, the physical shutdown of the subterranean network was not chaotic, it was coordinated. Across dozens of locations, the same sequence appears in construction logs, municipal permits, and engineering annotations. First, access routes were obstructed, stairwells collapsed, corridors were filled with aggregate, steel bulkheads were welded into place, ventilation shafts were sealed behind decorative masonry, drainage systems were re-routed, cutting off airflow and moisture circulation. Then came burial. Fresh concrete was poured directly over chambers, new foundation layers were added, entire sub-levels were entombed beneath reinforcements Keith officially described as structural upgrades. In some cases, new buildings were erected directly above sealed complexes, permanently locking them beneath active infrastructure. Not abandonment, erasure. And this process unfolded rapidly, within a remarkably narrow time frame. In city after city, the same permits appear: emergency structural modifications, accelerated reinforcement schedules, restricted access work orders, contractors bound by non-disclosure clauses, decades before such legal mechanisms were commonplace. The language used is revealing. Not renovation, not preservation, containment, isolation, stabilization, terms normally associated with hazardous material management, not obsolete architecture. Simultaneously, the public narrative shifted. Newspapers that once reported detailed train schedules and placement statistics reduced their coverage to sentimental anecdotes. Personal success stories replaced operational transparency. Photographs focused exclusively on smiling families, rural homesteads, and pastoral optimism. The system itself vanished from description. Rail manifests simplified, aid society publications shortened, government oversight reports condensed into vague endorsements. The entire logistical backbone of the movement was gradually stripped away, leaving only its emotional surface. And the silence held, for decades. In some regions, public access to station basements was permanently restricted. Fire inspection routes were altered. Emergency egress plans quietly avoided certain depths. Maintenance crews were instructed not to breach sublevels under any circumstances. Even as institutional memory faded, procedural memory remained. People no longer knew why those spaces were forbidden, only that they were. The final phase came in the form of administrative forgetting. Archive reorganizations quietly declassified entire collections. Indexing systems were restructured, breaking document continuity. Cross-references were removed, chronologies fragmented. Without destroying records outright, coherence itself was dismantled. What remained could no longer reconstruct what had existed, and so the story collapsed, not through denial, but through simplification. The orphan train became a moral parable: rescue, opportunity, renewal, a narrative so emotionally satisfying that no one asked what lay beneath it. But the buried infrastructure tells a different story, one of operational urgency, systematic movement, controlled processing, and sudden termination, which introduces a destabilizing implication. If the hidden network was shut down so abruptly, if it was sealed so completely, then something must have occurred that rendered its continued existence impossible, not politically inconvenient, but structurally incompatible with the narrative of benevolence, a moment when two timelines collided, and only one was allowed to survive, the official one, leaving the other compressed into silent stone and buried corridors, waiting for excavation to fracture the story we thought we understood. When viewed in isolation, each discovery can be rationalized: a forgotten chamber, a missing ledger, an altered blueprint, an administrative shortcut, a sealed corridor. But when assembled, they form something far less dismissible: a buried infrastructure, a continent-spanning logistical network, a synchronized documentation silence, and a narrative simplification so thorough it reshaped public memory itself. Which forces a broader question: what if the orphan train system was not merely a social program, but the visible surface of something far larger? Across Europe, Asia, and South America, similar anomalies exist. Underground dormitories beneath colonial transit hubs, sealed holding chambers below industrial schools, architectural voids beneath ports, hospitals, and migration centres, all dated to periods of mass population displacement. The same patterns recur: uniform depth, standardized geometry, ventilation symmetry, documentation absence, and eventual burial. Different countries, different governments, the same design logic, which suggests a possibility that destabilizes conventional history. That beneath multiple humanitarian, migration, and relief movements of the 19th and early 20th centuries, there may have existed a shared operational architecture, one that functioned beyond borders, outside public accountability, and largely beyond recorded memory. a system designed to move, process, and reassign human populations at scale. Not families, not individuals, but demographics. And once those demographic transitions were complete, the infrastructure was erased, not dismantled, sealed, because dismantling leaves evidence, erasure leaves silence. This reframes the orphan train not as an isolated episode of charity, but as one fragment of a much larger pattern, a pattern that reshaped nations, labour forces, genetic lineages, and cultural memory itself. If so, then the missing children were not merely lost to poor record keeping. They were absorbed into a system that did not require remembrance, only throughput, only movement, only outcome, which leaves us with a final unsettling uncertainty. How much of our inherited social structure was engineered through mechanisms we were never meant to see? How many population shifts, identity dissolutions, and demographic realignments were quietly executed beneath humanitarian narratives? And how many buried chambers remain sealed beneath the cities we inhabit, their existence known only to the architecture that surrounds them? History teaches us to study what was written, but architecture preserves what was done. And beneath the stations, schools, hospitals, and civic centres of the modern world, that architecture still exists, silent, sealed, and unaccounted for, waiting, not to be discovered, but to be remembered. Because once you recognise the pattern, it does not remain confined to one city, or one nation, or one era. It expands outward and backward and forward until the question is no longer what happened to the children of the orphan trains, but what unseen systems have always existed beneath the stories we are taught to believe.